The retrograde motion in Synastry. The retrograde has a reputation problem. In popular astrology, it has become synonymous with chaos. Most of that is related to Mercury retrograde, and most of that is exaggerated. But the reputation sticks. It tends to make people approach anything retrograde related with anxiety rather than curiosity. In Synastry, the retrograde motion is more specific and more interesting than bad timing. When one has planets retrograde in their natal chart, or when retrograde cycles are active during significant moments in a relationship, the dynamic that emerges is not chaos. It's internalization. The usual outward expression of a planetary function turns inward, more reflective, more recursive, more oriented towards depth and completion than towards speed and initiation. This changes how two people experience each other. Not necessarily worse, often more layered. It is differently timed, differently visible, and differently paced than connections where both people's planetary functions operate in their conventional outward mode. Understanding retrograde in Synastry means understanding what happens when one person's rhythm, the pace at which they process, respond, and express themselves, is fundamentally internally oriented. The most immediate thing retrograde activates is a timing difference. The retrograde person doesn't necessarily feel less, they often feel more, or at least more complexity. However, the expression of what they feel arrives later, travels through more internal processing before it becomes visible, and tends to operate on a longer cycle than the other person might expect. This is not avoidance. It's a different response architecture. Unresolved material from past relationships tends to surface. This is one of retrograde's most consistent and most under-acknowledged relational activations. The retrograde person carries prior relational history more actively than someone with the same planet in direct motion, not in the sense of being haunted by it, but in the sense of it remaining available, relevant, and sometimes unexpectedly present in the current connection. Past patterns get reworked rather than simply left behind. The private dimension of the relationship becomes disproportionately significant. What is felt internally in a retrograde-influenced connection often exceeds what is publicly visible. The depth of the bond may not be legible to external people. One may experience the relationship as more significant than their external behavior suggests, and the other person may find the gap between felt significance and visible expression confusing or hard to read. Cyclical interaction patterns are activated. The same themes return. This is not a sign of stagnation. It's the retrograde mechanism of working through material iteratively rather than linearly. The conversation that felt resolved may come back, slightly different, a few months later. The dynamic that seemed to have passed resurfaces. In the retrograde model, this is how integration actually happens, not at once and finished, but in layers, across time. Relational timing misalignment becomes a structural feature. The retrograde person is often not quite in sync with the collective pace of how relationships should be progressing, the conventional milestones, the expected sequences, the external markers of seriousness. This can make the relationship feel ambiguous to observers, or even to the non-retrograde partner. The retrograde person's internal experience is not necessarily ambiguous. Finally, the quality of completion and closure gets activated as a relational theme. Retrograde energy is oriented toward finishing cycles rather than opening new ones. The relationship may feel like it's working through something, closing a loop from before, completing an arc that neither person has fully named. The most characteristic quality of a retrograde-influenced connection is depth that arrives with a delay. The retrograde person often processes the most significant aspects of what they're experiencing privately and over time. This means the other person may be living with someone who is clearly feeling something but expressing it in partial or indirect form, while the full version is still being assembled internally. There's often a quality of layered familiarity. The sense that this person or this connection is somehow known, carries echoes of something prior. It feels less like a beginning and more like a continuation. This can also feel meaningful and grounding or slightly uncanny, particularly if neither person has language for what the connection is activating. For the non-retrograde partner, the experience often involves learning to read a different set of signals. The retrograde person's internal life tends to be richer and more active than their external presentation. What looks like reserve or distance is often deep engagement that hasn't yet found its form. What looks like circling back to old ground is often a genuine attempt to integrate something that wasn't complete the first time through. For the retrograde person, the experience of the relationship often has an interior quality that exceeds its outer form. They may feel the significance of the bond deeply without finding it easy to display that significance in the ways the other person is looking for. The feelings are real. The timing of their expression is simply different. There's also frequently a quality of the relationship feeling like it exists somewhat outside normal social time. Not secretly, but privately. The most consistent complication is the legibility gap. The retrograde person's internal experience and their external expression are often significantly out of proportion, and the non-retrograde partner may experience this as emotional unavailability, ambivalence, or mixed signals, when what is actually happening is a different processing architecture, not a different level of investment. This misreading, when it's not named and addressed, can become genuinely corrosive to the connection. The past activation that retrograde brings is both a resource and a risk. On the resource side, the retrograde person brings genuine depth. They carry relational history as something to learn from, not just as baggage. On the risk side, that same history can sometimes get layered onto the current relationship in ways that aren't accurate. The current partner occasionally gets read through the lens of a prior one. Current dynamics get interpreted through prior templates. This is usually unconscious, and it requires honest self-examination on the retrograde person's part to distinguish what is genuinely present from what is being carried forward. Cyclical return of the same themes can tip from productive to stuck. The retrograde mechanism of returning to material iteratively is useful, until the return stops producing movement and becomes a loop. The same conversation, the same friction, the same unresolved territory appearing again without any new integration is not the retrograde principle working, it's the retrograde shadow. The distinction between returning because integration isn't complete yet and returning because the loop is now the structure, that distinction matters and can be genuinely hard to identify. Timing pressure from the world outside can strain the dynamic significantly. Retrograde-influenced relationships often develop on a longer, less conventional timeline. External expectations from social circles, from family, from the general cultural script about what a relationship should look like by now, can create pressure that the retrograde person experiences as incompatible with how they actually need to process. The withdrawal cycle, that is, the retrograde person's periodic need to retreat inward, can be experienced as rejection if it's not understood in context. It isn't a retreat from the relationship. It's the natural rhythm of a processing style that moves in and out rather than remaining continuously outward-facing. When retrograde dynamics are understood and given room to operate on their actual timeline, the primary gift is genuine depth, the kind that develops specifically because neither person rushed to the surface. The late bloomer quality is one of retrograde's most distinctive relational contributions. These are the connections that reveal more over time than they disclosed at the start, where the initial impression was incomplete, where the relationship turns out to be substantially different and more significant a year or two in than it looked at the beginning. For people who have spent time in connections that peaked early and faded, this quality of deepening over time is not a small thing. The reworking of past material, when it's engaged honestly, produces a specific kind of relational intimacy that more outward-facing connections don't easily generate. Two people who can return to difficult territory together can revisit the conversation that wasn't complete. They can sit with unresolved themes without needing them to disappear. It tends to develop a quality of mutual trust that is genuinely durable. The private interior depth of a retrograde-influenced connection can be one of its most bonding qualities. The relationship creates a specific sense of shared territory that belongs only to the two of them. That interiority produces a particular quality of intimacy. The orientation toward completion and closure makes retrograde connections especially suited to working through things rather than away from them. When difficulty arises, the retrograde principle tends to favor return and integration over departure and avoidance. For people who have experienced relationships that dissolved at the first sign of complication, this quality of staying and working through has genuine value. Retrograde is not a broken direct motion. This is the most important misconception to name. A retrograde planet in someone's natal chart is not a malfunctioning version of the direct planet. It's a different orientation of the same function. The retrograde person processes that planetary energy inward rather than outward. It's a different architecture, with its own strengths and its own specific demands. Delay is not the same as absence. The retrograde person's slower internal expression of feeling is consistently mistaken for not feeling. The gap between internal experience and external expression is real and often significant. It requires active communication to bridge, but doesn't indicate emotional unavailability. The return of past themes is a feature, not a malfunction. Retrograde's iterative quality is not a sign that the relationship is stuck. It's the mechanism by which retrograde integration actually happens. The conversation returns because something wasn't complete the first time, not because nothing changed. Understanding this shifts the experience from frustration to something more navigable. The withdrawal cycle needs to be named, not interpreted. When a retrograde person periodically turns inward, becomes less available, quieter, less outwardly engaged, the non-retrograde partner often reads this as a relationship signal. Something is wrong, they're pulling away, the connection is cooling. It's worth naming this pattern explicitly early in the relationship, so that withdrawal can be understood as a processing rhythm rather than as a relational issue. The relationship's interior significance may exceed its external form for a long time. Retrograde-influenced connections are often more real inside than they appear to observers, or even to one of the two people. Allowing the relationship to be significant before it looks significant is one of the specific capacities retrograde synastry asks for. Retrograde in synastry ultimately asks, can you trust a timeline that isn't conventional? Can you stay present with depth that doesn't always announce itself? Can you return to the same territory repeatedly without treating that return as failure? These are not easy asks, but the connections that develop the capacity to answer yes tend to be among the most substantial and lasting ones. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.